My name is Eleanor Whitford, and on the morning my son realized his world was about to change, I was sitting at the head of my dining room table smoothing the lace tablecloth with steady hands. The house smelled of fresh biscuits and strong coffee, but it might as well have been a courtroom. In many ways it was. At 7:45, the sun had barely risen over Charleston when Caleb came downstairs, with that careless confidence he wore like a second skin. He did not notice the swelling on my lip or the dark bruise forming under my eye. He never looked long enough at anything that was not about him. He grabbed a biscuit, took a large bite, and started talking as if nothing in the world had shifted. He talked about how things were going to change in this house and how I needed to start respecting his decisions. His voice filled the room, loud and careless, until something else silenced him. The chair to my right moved. Caleb froze mid-sentence. His face drained of color, the biscuit crumbled from his fingers, and for a moment he simply stared with wide, unfocused eyes. Sitting in that chair, calm as a Sunday morning, was Judge Marion Steele. She had on a light linen suit, her posture straight and unshakable, her gaze fixed on him with the quiet power of a woman who had spent 40 years upholding the law. Behind her stood Detective Aaron Blake, along with 2 uniformed officers. Their presence filled the doorway, steady and deliberate. Caleb opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at me, then at them, and then back at me again. The truth settled on his shoulders like a weight he could not lift. My silence the night before had not been fear. It had been a verdict. To understand why this breakfast table became a place of judgment, you need to know what happened 6 hours earlier. 6 hours before that silent moment at the dining room table, my house felt like a different world. It was past 2:30 in the morning, and Charleston was wrapped in a hard, steady rain. The kind that makes the old live oaks groan and the shutters wobble against their hinges. I was in the kitchen, sitting in my worn rocking chair by the window. I had turned the radio down to a soft hum, letting an old hymn settle my nerves. At 67, sleep does not come easily, especially when the person living under your roof is unpredictable. I waited for the familiar sound of Caleb's truck, hoping it would not appear tonight, hoping he might have stayed somewhere else, somewhere safer for both of us. But at 3:15, the quiet broke. The front door rattled as someone fumbled with the key, not the gentle kind of fumbling either. It was rough, impatient, like the key itself was an enemy refusing to cooperate. I knew that sound all too well. It was the sound of a man who had drunk more than he could carry, and brought all his anger home with him. A moment later, the door slammed shut hard enough to shake the hallway mirror. Water dripped from Caleb's coat onto the floor, leaving dark spots on the wood. He stood there for a moment, a shadow outlined by the dim porch light, his breathing uneven. Nothing in that moment was new to me. I had lived through many nights like this, but I did not know that this particular night would be the one that ended everything and began something else entirely. This was the quiet before the storm. Caleb stepped into the kitchen doorway with the storm still clinging to him. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves, leaving a trail across the floor, but what hit me first was not the wet clothes. It was the sharp, sour smell of whiskey, not the good kind he used to savor on holidays, but the cheap kind that burns all the way down and drags a man's bitterness with it. He glanced around the room with glassy, unfocused eyes. Then he saw the ceramic vase on the hall table, the one his father had bought me on our 20th anniversary. Without a second thought, he brushed against it, knocking it to the floor. It shattered into bright pieces that scattered like tiny white stars across the hardwood. I opened my mouth to speak, but he got there first. "Do not start lecturing me, Mom," he slurred. "Not tonight." I kept my voice steady. "Caleb, go to bed. You are not well. We can talk in the morning." That was the spark. His face twisted, the muscles in his jaw tightening like a rope being pulled too hard. He stepped toward me, each step loud, heavy, deliberate. I stood from my rocking chair as calmly as I could, but my legs trembled. He grabbed my upper arms in a grip far too strong for a man who claimed he did not mean harm. His fingers dug into my skin. The force of it made my teeth clatter together. "Do not tell me what to do," he snapped. "Not you. Not anymore." Then he shook me hard. My head snapped back. The room blurred and swayed. When he released me, it was only so he could shove me backward. My body hit the corner of the china cabinet with a blunt crack. Pain shot down my spine. Before I could steady myself, his hand flew across my face in a sharp, open slap that echoed through the kitchen. The taste of iron filled my mouth. My lip burned, my cheek throbbed. And he walked away. Up the stairs, without a word, without a glance. Leaving me crumpled on the floor in a house that suddenly did not feel like mine. I stayed on the kitchen floor longer than I should have. The shock made everything feel distant, almost muted, like I was underwater. The rain outside kept tapping against the window, steady and indifferent, as if nothing remarkable had happened inside my walls. Eventually I pushed myself up using the edge of the table. My back flared with pain, and when I touched my lip, my fingers came away with a small streak of blood. I walked to the half-bath near the stairs, flipped on the light, and met my reflection. The woman staring back at me was one I barely recognized, a swollen lip, a bruise already beginning to bloom along my cheekbone, hair pushed out of place, but what struck me most were my eyes. They were not filled with fear, they were filled with something quieter and colder. Resolve. I turned on the cold water and washed my face, letting the shock settle into clarity. I had been afraid for so long that fear had become a kind of routine, something you breathe without knowing. But not tonight. Looking at myself in that mirror, I knew that if I did nothing, the next time Caleb lost control might be the last time I ever stood up again. So I did the only thing that kept my mind from spiraling. I cooked. I walked back into the kitchen, reached for the flour, butter, and baking powder, and set them on the counter. I took out the new baking sheet my sister Joanne had mailed me months ago. Rose gold non-stick, heavier than it looked. I preheated the oven and began mixing dough. Kneading the dough steadied my heartbeat. Cutting circles with the biscuit cutter gave my hands purpose. As the first tray went into the oven, the scent of butter began to fill the kitchen. A scent that once meant comfort. Tonight it meant determination. On the counter, the digital photo frame flickered to life, cycling through memories. There was Caleb at 8 years old holding a fishing pole. Caleb at 17 in his graduation gown. Caleb laughing at a 4th of July barbecue. Each picture asked the same question. Where did that boy go? The biscuits finished baking. I placed them on the cooling rack and began another batch. By the time the grandfather clock chimed 5, I knew exactly what I had to do, and what I was no longer willing to endure. This was the longest night of my life, and it was the night I chose not to be afraid anymore. Caleb's violence that night did not appear out of nowhere. It was the final drop in a bucket that had been filling, slowly and quietly, for years. When I look back now, I see the signs clearly, but at the time I kept explaining them away. Mothers do that. We tell ourselves our children are just stressed, just tired, just struggling. We refuse to see danger until it is pressed against our skin. Caleb had once been a proud, steady man. He worked at the Charleston shipping yard just like his father had. He loved the sense of purpose it gave him. But when the yard went through restructuring 2 years ago, he was pushed aside. Not fired outright but demoted, given smaller tasks, less responsibility, less respect, for a man who had tied his identity to work that cut deeper than any knife. He came home quieter at first, withdrawn. Then the quiet hardened into something sharp. Little things set him off. A faucet dripping, a misplaced envelope, a dinner not warm enough. He raised his voice more often, not quite yelling but speaking in a tone meant to remind me that he was no longer the boy I raised. Then came the drinking. What started as a beer after work became whiskey before dinner, then whiskey instead of dinner. His breath changed, his eyes changed, and slowly the way he looked at me changed too. Not with love, not even with indifference, but with resentment. As if I was the mirror that reflected everything he hated about his life. He borrowed money and never returned it. He used my credit card for his nights out. When I asked him to stop, he laughed and said, "It is all the same household, Mom. Do not make a big deal out of nothing." But it was something. It was the slow erosion of home, the slow shrinking of my world as I learned which footsteps meant trouble, which sigh meant a bad evening was coming. I became an expert at silence, at avoiding, at hoping. There were days when the man he used to be peeked through, days when he helped me carry groceries or asked how my garden was doing. Those glimpses were what kept me hoping he would find his way back, but they never lasted. The anger always returned heavier than before. And on that stormy night, when he put his hands on me, I finally saw the truth without excuses. The son I had loved all my life was buried under years of bitterness, and the man standing in front of me had become someone capable of destroying us both. That was when fear turned into clarity. and clarity turned into action. By 5:30 in the morning, the sky outside was still dark, but inside me something had lit up, a steadiness I had not felt in years. I stood at the sink, rinsing flour from my hands, and realized this night was no longer about fear. It was about choice, and I had finally made mine. My first call was to Judge Marion Steele. Marion and I had been friends for over 40 years. We raised our children in the same neighborhood, shared church pews, exchanged casseroles during hard times. But more than that, she had spent her career seeing the things most people pretend do not exist. She had dealt with the kinds of cases that change a person. She understood consequences. When she answered, her voice was alert despite the hour. "Eleanor, what happened?" I did not give her every detail. I did not need to. She heard the tremor beneath my words, the truth hiding in the pauses. She took a breath and said, "I will be there at 8. You will not face this alone." My second call was to Detective Aaron Blake, a man I had met through volunteer work at church. He was steady, direct, and known for handling sensitive situations with care. When I told him what had happened, he asked just one question: "Is Caleb still in the house?" "Yes, he is asleep upstairs." Aaron's tone shifted. "Listen to me carefully. Stay in a separate room. Do not wake him. Do not confront him. We will arrive in the morning. Can you do that?" I told him I could. My final call was to my sister Joanne in Raleigh. She was the only person who knew even a fraction of what I had been dealing with. When she heard my voice, she did not ask why I was calling so early. She simply said, "Tell me what he did." I told her, and for the first time in years, I did not minimize or soften anything. There was a long quiet on the line before she spoke again. "Eleanor, you are doing the right thing. You should have done it months ago. I am proud of you." I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of warm biscuits and the sound of a storm beginning to ease. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to hope. There would be consequences. There had to be. But I would not walk into them alone. As the night thinned into early morning, the rain finally softened. The house felt strangely still, as if holding its breath with me. I wiped down the kitchen counters, gathered the last batch of biscuits from the rack, and began arranging everything on the dining table. If this day was going to bring truth into the open, I wanted the room to reflect the clarity I felt inside. I chose the ivory tablecloth I kept for holidays. It was one of the few things Caleb had never ruined or dismissed as unnecessary. I smoothed the corners, letting the fabric fall evenly. Then I set out my old wedding china. White porcelain, silver trim. My husband and I had saved for months to buy it. Using it today felt fitting, as if a part of him would be present at the table where everything would change. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and placed it in the center. The steam curled upward in gentle ribbons. I sliced fruit, arranged it neatly, and added a dish of honey just the way Caleb used to like it. These touches were not for him. They were reminders to myself that I still lived in this home, that I could create something warm even on the coldest morning. On the floor near the hallway, I deliberately left the broken pieces of the anniversary vase. I swept the rest of the house, but not those shards. I wanted Caleb to step over them, to see what his anger had done, to face what he tried so hard to deny. When the table was finished, I changed into a simple navy dress. I pulled my hair back, wiped the last traces of flour from my wrists, and looked once more in the mirror. The bruise on my cheek had darkened, but the steadiness in my eyes made it feel less visible. I went to the dining room, sat at the head of the table, and folded my hands. This was not breakfast. This was truth arranged on linen. And soon, it would speak louder than anything I could say. At 7:45, I heard Caleb's steps on the stairs. Heavy, uneven, dragging slightly the way his footsteps always did after a night of drinking. I kept my gaze on the table, listening as he made his way through the hallway. He stopped when he noticed the broken vase pieces. I heard the pause in his breathing. Then I heard the dismissive scoff. He stepped over them as if they were nothing but trash on a sidewalk. When he entered the dining room, he hesitated at the sight of the table. The linen cloth, the wedding china, the biscuits still warm. For a moment he seemed unsure. Then he smirked. "Well, look at this," he said, as if the room existed to please him. "You didn't have to go all out, but I guess you finally realized some things around here need to change." He took a biscuit without asking and bit into it loudly. He chewed while talking, crumbs falling onto the tablecloth I had spent so long smoothing. "You know, Mom," he continued, "I have been thinking, we are going to rearrange things in this house. I am tired of you acting like everything is yours to decide. It is time you start listening to me for once." His words hung in the air like a bitter fog. Then the doorbell rang. Caleb glanced toward the hallway, mildly annoyed, and took another bite. When the second chime echoed, sharper and more insistent, he frowned. I stood from my chair. My knees trembled slightly, but my voice was steady. "I will get it." He shrugged, not suspecting anything. But the moment Judge Marion Steele stepped into the dining room, followed by Detective Aaron Blake and 2 uniformed officers, Caleb froze. The smirk vanished, his eyes widened, his body went still, as if someone had pressed pause on him. He looked at me, then at them, then back at me again. Confusion, fear, disbelief, all of it rising in waves. "Mom, what is this?" he whispered. He had no idea that he was already standing inside his own verdict. Judge Marion Steele took her seat at the table as if she had always belonged there. Her posture was calm but unmistakably firm, the kind of presence that made anyone with a guilty conscience shrink in their own skin. Detective Aaron Blake stood behind her, hands folded, observing Caleb with quiet focus. Caleb's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a script he had never rehearsed. "Mom, why are they here? What is going on?" I gestured toward the chair opposite mine. "Sit down, Caleb." He did not move. Marion spoke first, her voice even and controlled. "Caleb Whitford, we are here because your mother asked for help. This is not a surprise visit. This is an intervention with legal oversight." "Intervention?" Caleb scoffed, but the sound cracked. "For what? I did not do anything." Detective Blake stepped forward. "That is not what we were told." Caleb's gaze darted around the room, but there was nowhere to land that gave him any comfort. When his eyes finally met mine, I saw an emotion I had not seen in years. Fear. I took a deep breath. I needed to say the words, even if they trembled on the way out. "Caleb, last night you hurt me?" He shook his head wildly. No, Mom, I might have been upset, but I did not hurt you. You are exaggerating, you always exaggerate." Marion looked at him steadily. "Your mother is sitting at this table with visible injuries. Caleb, this is not something that can be dismissed with denial." I reached up, touched the bruise on my cheek, then lowered my hand. "I am not exaggerating, Caleb. You shoved me, you slapped me, you walked away while I was on the floor." A long silence followed. Caleb's face collapsed into something softer, almost childlike. "Mom, I did not mean to. I was drunk. You know I have been stressed. You should have just left me alone." That sentence was the clearest truth he had spoken, and the one that hurt the most. Detective Blake spoke again, his tone steady. "Stress does not excuse violence. Alcohol does not excuse violence. Nothing excuses violence against your mother." Caleb sank into the nearest chair, his hands gripping the edges as if the room were spinning. "Why would you call them? Why would you betray me like this?" I felt tears gather but refused to let them fall. "I am not betraying you. I am protecting myself. And I am giving you a chance to face what you have become." Marion nodded gently. "Consequences are not cruelty, Caleb. They are often the first step toward change." Caleb looked between the 3 of us, his voice breaking in a whisper. "Mom, please. Do not do this." But it had already begun. Detective Aaron Blake stepped closer, his voice calm but carrying a weight that filled the room. "Caleb Whitford, based on the statements provided and the visible injuries on your mother, we are placing you under temporary custody for further investigation." Caleb shot up from his chair so quickly it scraped harshly against the floor. No, you cannot do this." "Mom, tell them. Tell them it is not what she is saying. Tell them I did not mean it." His voice cracked on the last word. Marion watched him with reserved patience, the way someone experienced in the law learns to observe without reacting. Detective Blake signaled to the officers, who stepped forward with quiet, practiced movements. Caleb backed toward the wall, shaking his head. "Mom, please, you are my mother. You cannot let them take me." I stood from my chair. My legs were unsteady, but my voice was not. "Caleb, I have forgiven you more times than I can count, but I cannot ignore what you did, not anymore." As the officers gently pulled his hands behind his back, he stopped resisting. Tears streaked down his face, the fear in his eyes raw and unfamiliar. "You will regret this," he whispered, broken and trembling. "Maybe," I said softly, "but I will not regret choosing my life today." The click of the handcuffs echoed through the dining room, a sound I never imagined I would hear in my home. Then they led him out the front door. and the house finally exhaled. When the front door closed behind the officers, the silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever heard in this house. For years, silence meant anticipation, fear, waiting for footsteps or the next outburst. Now it simply meant quiet, real quiet, the kind that settles on the walls and sinks into your skin. Judge Marion stayed with me for a while. She helped me gather the dishes, though neither of us touched the broken vase pieces on the hallway floor. Those would wait. There was no rush to erase the evidence of truth. Before leaving, Marion placed a hand on my arm. "Eleanor, this is the beginning of a long path, but it is a path toward safety, and toward yourself. Call me if you need anything." Detective Blake checked in as well, making sure I understood the next steps, statements, documentation, a possible restraining order. He explained everything clearly, never once making me feel pressured or ashamed. When he left, I thanked him not just for coming, but for believing me without hesitation. That afternoon, I finally allowed myself to sleep. I lay on the couch with a blanket pulled up to my chin and felt my body sag into a kind of exhaustion I had been carrying for years. When I woke, the storm had passed. Sunlight pushed through the blinds in soft golden strips. In the days that followed, I began rebuilding pieces of my life I had forgotten I was allowed to have. I installed new locks. I ordered security cameras. I signed up for a support group through the church, where women sat in folding chairs and told stories that sounded too familiar. They welcomed me without questions. I began tending to my garden again, pruning the roses that had grown wild from neglect. I baked for myself instead of for someone who never said thank you. I read books in the evening without listening for footsteps overhead. Then came the letter. It arrived a week after Caleb was taken into custody. The envelope was thin, the handwriting shaky. Inside was a page filled with apologies. He said he was ashamed, that he did not recognize the person he had become, that getting arrested had forced him to see what he had been doing to both of us. I cried reading it, not because it erased the pain, but because it acknowledged it. And acknowledgement is its own kind of healing. 3 months later, after mandatory counseling and a court-ordered rehabilitation program, Caleb asked to meet with me. Not at the house, not anywhere private. He requested a supervised conversation at a small community center room, the kind with folding tables, fluorescent lights, and a pot of stale coffee in the corner. I arrived early. My hands shook a little, but not from fear, from uncertainty, from the weight of knowing that forgiveness and restoration are not always the same thing. When Caleb walked in, he looked smaller somehow, not physically but in spirit. The anger he once carried like armor was gone. His shoulders were lower, his voice quieter when he said, "Hi, Mom." We talked for almost an hour. He apologized again, this time without excuses. He said he understood why I had called the authorities. He said he wanted to rebuild, but only in ways that were healthy for both of us. I told him the truth. I forgave him. I wanted him to heal. But the life we once had was not one we could return to. I needed boundaries, space, safety. We could meet in public places, but he would not live with me again. He nodded. He did not argue. For the first time in years, he listened. As we parted, he said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I responded gently. I did not give up. I simply stopped disappearing. And that made all the difference. When I look back on everything that happened, I do not see a story about punishment. I see a story about awakening. For years I believed that loving someone meant carrying their pain, their anger, and even their harm. But love without boundaries is not love, it is erasure. I learned that choosing myself was not betrayal. It was survival. And sometimes survival looks like a quiet woman standing at her own dining room table, deciding she will not be broken in her own home. If you are listening to this and something in my story feels familiar, I hope you hear this clearly. You matter, your safety matters, and you do not have to wait for a breaking point to reclaim your life. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, please like the video, share it, and tell me where you are watching from. Your support helps bring more real stories to light,